And for our purposes, the Nazis had some problems in determining what their master race might be. They were obsessed with the idea that it was blood. Our terminology these days would be a gene pool, a kind of so-called Aryan gene pool. It's louder than snap, crackle, and pop. Should I move back a ways? Great. Okay. Is that all right now if I'm back here? Super. Okay, so about this problem of trying to determine what and who constituted the members, so to speak, of the Germanic master race, and we'll look at some of the characteristics that Nazis felt were sure signs of being a member of the Nazi race, and for not being a member of the Nazi race, but the master race. But first of all, I want to put the idea of a master race in a historical perspective. Certainly the Nazis were the most brutal and the most systematic in employing over a 12 or 6-year period of the war, employing the idea and the application of a master race. But we need to keep in mind that there have been less conscious examples of peoples, cultures, family groups that have lorded it over their subjects one way or another. And we can probably say that one thing that the Nazis, with their idea of a master race, definitely lacked was any kind of a mission for those, a positive, constructive mission for those whom they dominated. We can look at the Spanish conquistadors, very definitely set apart from the people whom they conquered in the New World. We can look at the Arabs as a people spilling out of the desert, both with their religious mission of Islam or Catholic Christianity for the conquistadors. And even though they definitely were warlike and conquering and carved out huge empires, and by the way, empires that lasted many centuries one way or another, they have some consideration for the peoples over whom they ruled, and for that matter too, we see a gradual assimilation, ethnic assimilations, language assimilations, and so forth among both Arabs and their subject people, and the Spanish conquistadors among the indigenous peoples of America. So this, of course, sets them apart from the Nazis, who were definitely intent on segregating the perceived members of their master race from any of the subject peoples for fear of blood pollution. And by blood pollution, we mean the injection of harmful physical and, well, ideological, even racial characteristics that would tend to restrain the Aryan race from reaching its full potential. The idea of the German master race had within it this idea of improving the race, the racial hygiene, so to speak, the racial components of its members, and allowing for very, very strict segregation, and in fact, as we know, the outright elimination, brutalization, even the extermination of subject peoples that were seen as harmful to the fulfillment, the self-development. The fact that they really had nothing that they wanted to give that was of benefit to their subject peoples. It was basically tax, draft, extort, and punish. But if you complied as a subject people with the Mongol program, so to speak, the Mongols would, at least for the most part, leave you alone. And that, of course, was a difference from the Nazi idea that the Nazis would not leave you alone if they felt that you were undesirable, social or racial undesirable, that might threaten to mix in with the Aryan blood, so-called. They had to make sure that you may be sterilized, you may be segregated, you might be harassed out of the area, or ultimately exterminated in gas chambers or whatever, slave labor camps or whatever it might be. So in this sense, the Nazis were far more methodical and systematic than Mongols or Incas, who had a strong conception of themselves as a royal family, an elite master family, but they did have, despite their huge conquests and their relocation of peoples, they had a certain soft spot for local traditions, or at least for local political rulers, and in this respect allowed for degrees of local variations within their 2,000-mile empire from Ecuador to Argentina. And of course this empire didn't last as long as the Mongol empire, but it lasted a lot longer than the 12-year Nazi Reich, with its pretensions to lasting for 1,000 years. So we also, getting back to the question of who qualified in the definition of the master race, we basically had qualifications that were supposed to be linked to blood, proper Aryan blood, but how were you going to determine the blood? And this was in an age long before genetics really took off and DNA and things like that. So the testing, so to speak, for who seemed to fit in the Aryan race fell back upon such things as language, oral characteristics, proper view of the world, one way or another, behavior patterns. But again, this could cause problems because there were people, certainly in Hitler's view, Jews especially, that conformed with speaking the language, with behaving as good Germans. We saw in the film last time the family out there skiing and dancing. And
I'm going to try and pull this back.
I must special inclination for wanting to get close to it.
See if that helps.
How about that? Any better? Sorry for putting you through the ordeal, but it could be worse. Okay, so the problem in part was that there were subject races, inferior races, that attempted to Germanize or Slavicize, and so the Nazis had to go through various efforts to try to decouple these apparent Germans, and some were far less apparent than others, from the Aryan race, so-called the master race. And so there were efforts to look at their behavior patterns, especially in terms of, were the Germans not only of seemingly the proper blood and the proper language, but were they, how should we say, worthy of reproducing? Did they have any hereditary diseases? Remember in the film last week we saw the daughter of the woman that was diagnosed as having schizophrenia, and how she was eventually killed in a hospital setting as a person basically unworthy to be allowed to reproduce, although certainly the mother was well along in age. Then there was, besides this question of their heredity, whether it's Jewish blood or just poor Aryan blood, deformed Aryan blood, so to speak, there was the question of to what degree could they work for the community. The Nazi idea of the national community, the Volksgemeinschaft, as a group of Germans all working toward a greater destiny, a greater fulfillment of themselves as Germans. These people would be held back by those that didn't want to contribute to the cause, that didn't participate actively in the cause. Criminal types, perhaps, work shy people, so to speak, those that didn't want to pull their weight one way or another. Something had to be done with these, the asocial, those that did not want to join the cause. So this was another example of those that didn't quite fit in with the idea of the forward-looking master race, even if they were deemed in other respects to be Aryan. And in fact, the effort was made if they're sterilized, so they wouldn't reproduce as bad Germans, so to speak, then in theory they could be embraced into the body of the German people, the Deutsches Volk. There was also the characteristic of being ideologically worthy. You couldn't be a communist, you couldn't be a Jehovah's Witness, you had to pledge allegiance basically to the regime, you had to participate in an affirmative way to the National Socialist ideals. And let's remember, too, that the idea of National Socialism, as we filmed last week, was that the nation would form the new society, and that the class antagonisms, the class divisions that had bothered and kind of perplexed German society, whether it was in the earlier Second Reich up to World War I, or whether it was in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, that a National Socialist community would override the class distinctions that seemed to have caused problems in Germans fulfilling their national destiny. Speaking of divisions, one problem with the master race is that it turned out that some were more master than others, and we have a natural gravitation toward elites within the master race, and you saw that with some of the SS officers last time. They were specially to join the SS, and so in a sense some Germans were more equal than others, to paraphrase George Orwell. So we've got various qualifications for membership, so to speak, for belonging to the master race, but ultimately whatever your ideology, whatever your view of participating with the regime, it all boiled down to a matter of blood, that blood made you tick the way you were, and if you didn't conform then to you didn't have a proper quantity of proportion of Aryan blood within you. For those that did not belong, were deemed as unworthy of belonging to the race, we have these so-called ideological enemies, the asocial types, and then the biologically inferior types, Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, peoples that were seen as obvious racial threats to the German kind of gene pool, the stock of good blood. And on occasion, there were dilemmas for the Nazis when they came across non-Germans that didn't even speak German, that were, in a sense, blonde, blue-eyed, physically strong, tall, attractive, and the idea that, wow, maybe these people could be turned into good Germans. And some, in fact, were attracted or coerced this way. This was this process, we don't know how often it happened, but obviously favoritism toward these people in camps and otherwise was called transnationalization, Umvolkung. The Poles and others that seemed to qualify in terms of their outward attributes might have a chance at becoming at least more closely affiliated with master race. Well, let's take a look at the lost my watch here. I wouldn't want to get carried away up here. Let's look at the origins of the. Oh, just hold a second. I wanted to give you some definitions, or at least some discussions coming from a number of several Nazis in their view of the master race versus subhuman races. Chronologically, we could probably just have a quick quote from Adolf Hitler. We'll hear more from him later on. This was a quote from Hitler on the day of the Polish, the week before the Polish invasion, when Operation Barbarossa was. Hitler said, "I've given orders to my death units to exterminate without mercy or pity all men, women, and children belonging to the Polish-speaking race." There's a definition of race as determined by the very language that the Poles spoke. It is only in this manner that we can acquire, the master race, can acquire the vital territory which we need. So built in with the idea of a German master race was the idea that Germans did not have enough room to develop as they ought to be, as was their right, and obviously the idea of conquest and expansion, especially to the east among the perceived inferior Slavic peoples, as opposed to north into Scandinavia, where we've got fellow Germanic peoples, or even into England. This, again, is the stretching the idea of the master race. Probably the Slavs were not master race at all, other than these blonde, blue-eyed Poles, but that the Dutch, the English, the Scandinavians on occasion were seen as potential members of the master race. Even people of German background in the United States and North America, Hitler saw as potentially rallying to the cause and coming back home to work for the full community. We have another quote from Erich Koch, who was the commissioner for the Ukraine once the invasion of Russia was the Barbarossa campaign. Once the invasion had occurred, and he claimed there in Kiev, "We are a master race, and we must remember that the lowliest German laborer is racially and biologically 1,000 times more valuable of our blood," meaning that this mix of Mongols and Slavs off there in Russia had to redeem it, the intermixture of just a few German settlers here and there that gave it what redeeming qualities it had. So you get some idea of some views from high Nazis once they're there in the field, looking at the Ostvolk, of a special destiny for Germany, and increasingly an idea that Jews and other peoples, even French and so forth, were in the way of fulfilling Germany's national destiny. We might briefly look at the setting in the 19th century. Germany had been shaken to its foundations during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period, if you will, 1806, if you want a date. And along with this, not only did the Germans have to deal with this question of a superpower state, which was the exact antithesis of what they had for themselves, but they also had to deal with the emancipation of German Jews on the part of the French conquerors, that the idea of a more liberal society that came out of France called for not only the emancipation of serfs and the redemption of Germany from feudalism, but the emancipation of German Jews. Karl Marx's family is a good example of this. We'll get back to Karl Marx a little bit later. Karl Marx's father was an emancipated German Jew that favored the French and in fact decided to convert to Protestant Christianity, as some of the Jews in Germany did. Not a lot, but some did. And so Germany would go through the blood and iron experience of the unification of Germany that occurred later on in the century under the leadership of Count Bismarck, the forming of the Second Reich. This dominant status of Germany in Europe through war and through force was something that didn't necessarily satisfy these yearning German romantics that were looking for more Germany. They felt that the bureaucracy of the new German Second Reich, the new German Empire, was something alien to them. They didn't necessarily like the behavior of the royal family, the Kaiser's family. In fact, they felt it was affected by Jewish financiers, and there was too many liberties for Jews within the Second Reich. The very term anti-Semitism is coined about this time, and basically the idea that Germany wasn't getting a place for itself in the sun, not only not being a part of the colonization of the overseas world that Britain and France were a part of, but that there was also the problem of Germans outside of the new nation state, to the degree, a far larger degree than there were of any other peoples that didn't fit, that weren't included in the new nation state making that was occurring throughout the 19th century. So this question of that matter, ideas of democracy, ideas of liberalism, ideas of pluralism and so forth were seen as Romance civilization, Latin civilization ideas that were perceived as alien to a true Germanic spirit. So we see as early as the age of Napoleon, some German thinkers and activists that were that expressed some of these romantic ideas that would lead ultimately to the application of many of these very same ideas under the Nazis in the 1930s and early 40s. And we need to look, some of these names and concepts are down at the bottom of your page. We need to look at Johann Fichte, for instance, Professor Fichte had a series of addresses to the German nation. And here basically he advocated the idea of authority of German culture. German culture just didn't have a state to back it up. And both in music and in creative writing and so forth, some of the arts, the philosophy and so forth, that not only was German culture superior, but it was more profound, and that the Germans had a moral right to use force in fulfilling their destiny. Through cunning, force, whatever was necessary, the Germans had a right to at least get equality with the French and the British, and then go on from there. And who knows what the last chapter in this fulfillment of German destiny might be. We had, about this same time during the French occupation in the early 19th century, the activist Ludwig Jahn. I'm sorry I forgot his name on the contributors, but I ran out of space, so I couldn't get them all in, squeeze them all in. Maybe some of you are thankful for that. But Father's, in some ways, the first articulate exponent of this idea of self-discipline and exercise. You saw men and women doing their exercises all in sync last week in the movie to develop their physical prowess and so forth. And basically, Ludwig Jahn was the founder of gymnastic societies, which was irrevocably tied in with German patriotism. That the Germans would drill and train themselves so they could overthrow the French, and through, you might say, a kind of will to power, but a self-disciplining, they would be ready to liberate Germany from the cursed French occupiers and go on to build a single united German nation. In fact, the question of, is the nation more important than the state? These were questions debated in the early and middle 19th century, even before racial concepts became into. Going further on down our list, we need to mention, in fact, comment that we have not just Germans contributing to this, but to our folkish ideas, but we've got some foreigners too, and Arthur Gobineau is a Frenchman who wrote a book that was very influential in Germany, far more than France, on the inequality of races. And even though he was really one of those cursed French thinkers, his ideas were receptive and they gave Germans something to think about in terms of the inequality of races. And as you might say the German cultural renaissance continues on apace, there was more fodder for the idea that the Germans were indeed culturally superior, with Beethoven and Heinrich Heine, a good example of a German Jew who was quite creative, although some of the thinkers wouldn't say that. But whether it's in music or in literature especially, or in philosophy with Schopenhauer and later Nietzsche, there was this idea that somehow the Germans were unequal because of the profundity of their thought and their creative efforts. We have, interestingly, Professor Paul de la Garde. He had a German name, but he decided to change it to a French name. Please don't ask why. But Paul de la Garde was a professor at Göttingen, I think. At any rate, he came up with a series of writings called German writings. You've got the date on your sheet, and he is the coiner, as far as can be determined, of the term master race, a Herrenvolk. And besides this, this little contrast that got much larger later on, Professor Lagarde was concerned less about racial purity than he was about purifying German religion. That German religion had too much Christianity in it, and Christianity was tainted by its Jewish backgrounds. We'll be talking more about this later. Obviously, its a central figure, Jesus Christ, was of Jewish background, and this provides a big problem for those that are interested in purifying the master race. What to do about Christianity one way or another. We'll see ultimately that Hitler has his own solution for this, but he isn't given enough time to implement it. But at any rate, the idea of a kind of a Nordic religion that purges all of the Middle Eastern and Jewish and non-German elements out of it. And in fact, part of this, I'm not sure Professor Lagarde's idea, but part of this was the excuse that Jesus had to have been an Aryan. He was just too heroic. He followed the leadership principle. He had great qualities of leading the people, if you will, and that maybe by the virtue of the fact that he was a Galilean and not a real Jew, a central Jew, presumably he was blue-eyed and that he was a small pocket of Aryans that had somehow ended up in Galilee, who have been that way because of who Jesus was. Well, that didn't convince a lot of people on many different sides of the camps. But at any rate, this was one of the rationales for somehow Aryanizing Christ and Christianity. We also have from Lagarde the idea of Mittel Europa, or Central Europe, Middle Europe, which would be the natural domination realm of the master race. This would include the Baltic areas of the southeast. It would include the decrepit kind of polyglot Habsburg Empire, and these were areas which would be the natural sphere of domination of the master race. Lagarde did not mention the eastern fields of Russia, the Russian Empire at this time, but his ideas were important and went through many editions. They had an impact on one of Hitler's closest, not the most close, but a close confidant, Alfred Rosenberg, who was a kind of racial advisor to Adolf Hitler. Also about this time we have the development of anti-Semitism as a concept. The term seems to have been first used by Wilhelm Marr. You have this entered in your list of names and so forth. And Marr was concerned about cleansing the German language, not just the church, the religion, but the language of foreign words. There weren't too many Yiddish words or Jewish words that had made their way into the German language, but there were other French words, Italian, Latin words, and so forth. And so this idea of cultural cleansing is important among some of the populist, folkish, neo-romantic thinkers. Went so far as to call Bismarck's German Empire a new Palestine, which gives us at least some inkling, some insight into the idea of how unsatisfactory it was, that there was too much Jewish influence advising the court on, well, obviously things like newspaper publishing and so forth. So that in terms of these kind of cleansing romantics, the Second Empire was really a very unsatisfactory culmination of the national unification movement, and more needed to be done, both at home and abroad, outside of Germany proper. We should keep in mind that probably the Austrian, not probably, but definitely the Austrian Empire was the greatest repository of outside Germans, but there were Germans in the Russian Empire, there were Germans in Switzerland, and so, and in fact, Julius Longbane, next on our list here, had this idea that there were, in a sense, honorary Germans even in England and in Holland. And in fact, just as for some, Jesus as one who had to have been an Aryan, Shakespeare had to have been Germanic. Rembrandt had to have been Germanic just by virtue of the power and the depth of their creative effort. And Longbane wrote a work that came out in 1890 called Rembrandt as Educator. I don't have that on the book here, but that Rembrandt had a mission, had a message for Germans all over, that you didn't have to be within the boundaries of the German Empire, that in a sense Dutch were honorary members too, and especially ones that comprised all characteristics of what a good German, what the Aryan blood ought to be. Longbane glorified the primitive Saxon peasant, lower Saxon peasant, those of North Germany that were basically Protestant and hadn't been corrupted by Latin culture one way or another. Actually, he had second thoughts about some of these things. But remember when I think the SS officer said, why should we contribute money toward the infirm when we can be helping out German peasants? German peasants obviously were part of the stock pool, especially the blonder ones and the more robust physical specimens and so forth. And of course they were farther from the south. The many of these neo-romantics were, not all, but many were from the northern parts of Germany, and they tended to distrust the Rhineland and Bavaria with their Catholicism and their their Romance civilization, the fact they were part of the Roman Empire way, way back and so forth. So this idea of purification is important, and Longbane came out and said basically the Germans need to be part of a Germanic landscape. The landscape, the soil, is going to nurture them, and Germans too far removed from this Germanic soil base are going to have problems, something that Hitler did not heed when he invaded Russia, where there was Slavic soil. But the idea of Boden, blood and soil, is going into the German character, and of course the blood is the all-important determinant. The greatest expressions of the German Aryan master race were art and war. They were most creative in these two contexts. And of course, warring Germans in the past were elevated, not just by Longbane, by others later, those that had fought against that Romanizer Charlemagne, those that had fought against the Imperial Roman legions, the famous Hermann the German, who came out of the forests of Saxony and defeated the emperor's legions. That sounds great in English, but in German it doesn't rhyme. But at any rate, those that had fought to keep Germany away from Mediterranean civilization. So I think it's important that we see that the master race idea had its cultural determinants too, and this kind of poser who was an Aryan ideologue and largely anti-Semitic. Wagner suggests that moving beyond Wilhelm Marr and his anti-Semitism, that the flip side of the coin of trying to purge German arts and German music from Jewish infiltrations one way or another was important. Wagner talked about purifying the race force. Once again, as we saw in the film, Germans had lost the kind of 100% Germanness through intermarriage and miscegenation over the many centuries, and they had to regain their lost virtues of pride, honor, fearlessness, and so forth. And Wagner was able to establish a kind of Germanic cult at his home base at Bayreuth, where the big Wagner festivals still occur to this day, celebrating Wagner's art. But they were havens for, you might say, master race and anti-Semitic ideology, thought, so forth. And Wagner's son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, should be on your list somewhere, was the carryover of this anti-Semitic tradition, and one of Adolf Hitler's great moments in the 1920s, before he was slapped in prison, where he wrote Mein Kampf, was going to Bayreuth and meeting Wagner's son-in-law, and in a sense imbuing the kind of supremacist air of Bayreuth to this kind of nest of master race folkish ideology. Now, another individual that was co-opted by the folkish thinkers, and certainly by the Nazis, was Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous good European, the famous philosopher, and so forth. And amidst many of Nietzsche's differentiated moments of thought and writing, he referred to the blonde beasts, for instance, or the Überman. In this sense, he was thinking less of a racial type, but as a cultural type, a person that rose above the mediocrity of banal bourgeois society as epitomized in the Second Reich of Bismarck and the Kaisers. So this idea of somehow a new race of super types that would have to work on it. They weren't just that way by virtue of blood, being born into it, as we saw the babies there in the film. And in effect, Nietzsche's sister tended to be more pro-Nazi one way or another, and in a sense turn her brother's philosophy more in a direction that would be acceptable to the Nazis later on. Well, this takes us up at least until just before World War I, and we need at this point to depart from the family, so to speak, of proto-Nazi thinkers. Let's just mention in brief a comment from the observer Peter Vierek, who claims Hitler and Nazism had not a single characteristic that these men, these thinkers that we just mentioned and described, that these men did not know or name, which they first worshipped and then they warned against long before Hitler. So that tells us that Longbane of the German war effort outside of Germany. We're talking about the Western Front, especially with the arrival of the Americans in 1918, and the enigma, as it appeared to many Germans, of how can we have lost this war when we were not even invaded? There must have been treachery involved in this loss, in this humiliation, so to speak, of Germany losing the war. And so the certain elements were intrigued as to who was there negotiating with the Allies on Armistice Day in November of 1918. And in fact, upon closer observation, it was found that some were the Social Democrat Party, that it had Marxist leanings earlier on. There, I didn't prepare his name in my mind, Walter so-and-so was one of the German capitulation to the Western Allies. The Germans had already defeated the newly emerged Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik Revolution had come, and of course, from Hitler's point of view, the Bolsheviks were the pawn, so to speak, of a Jewish ideology. As he put it, Bolshevism was the illegitimate stepchild of Christianity. They both had Jewish leaders, Jesus or Marx, and the one followed from the other. This may strain your credibility one way or another, but from Hitler's point of view, any kind of ideology that was infused with Jewish thought was racially depraved one way or another. And this was seen by the Germans defeating the Bolsheviks earlier in 1918, and in fact capturing large swaths of what had been the Russian Empire. So for about 6 or 7 months from until November, I suppose my addition is incorrect, but the point was that between the treaty with Russia and the Armistice Day, when all of Germany had to collapse and the Kaiser was forced to abdicate by the Allies, there was a kind of glorious feeling that Germany could win the war. In fact, Germany had won the war in the East, and that there was Lebensraum, living space, that had fallen to the Germans, to the German military, was lost by this capitulation there on the Western Front, and the German military had to move back and give this land over to the Bolsheviks once again. So this was definitely part of the stab in the back idea, conception, myth, legend, that somehow the German collapse had been caused by treachery from within, and the result of this was the humiliating Peace of Versailles. I'm not sure if you talked about it in your discussion sections, but needless to say, the Versailles peace brought with it the reduction of the German territory in Germany itself, the stigma of war guilt. Germany was responsible for World War I, and hence had to pay reparations to all of the damaged allies. Other allies of Germany had to pay reparations, but they weren't stuck with it's Germany's fault. And Germany had to sign on the line that the negotiators had to sign that it was Germany's fault. And that wasn't all. Germany lost her overseas colonies. Now, this was not a problem to the racial thinkers. They didn't care at all about overseas colonies. It would obviously be dangerous for Germans out there interacting with natives in China or Africa or the Pacific Islands or wherever Germany had its very few colonies. But Germany was forced to become a republic, Western style, a parliamentary, a pluralistic democratic republic, which was seen by these neo-patriots as harmful to this idea of some kind of a folk community and a more authoritarian type of leadership. And Germany was demilitarized along the French border. The German military had placed on it a ceiling of no more than 100,000. And so there was a lot of things that added to the humiliation of Germany at this time that obviously gave incentive for people listening to the opposing voices, such as the newly formed National Socialist Party. Let's just talk briefly about a couple of other things among the discontents of the Weimar Republic period, those that eschewed any kind of association with the Weimar system. By the way, Weimar is the name of the town. In fact, the town where Goethe and Schiller, some of the great exponents of German culture in its more cosmopolitan international sense, had lived earlier on. And so Weimar was deliberately set as the town that that where the constitution of this new democratic republic was to go into being there, and the whole idea of Weimar was anathema, these neoconservative, neo-romantic patriots. But we have other ideas coming out of the woodwork too, such as the famous philosopher Oswald Spengler, who wrote the first volume of his famous work, not quite so famous in the 1990s, but certainly famous for a long time, after World War I, The Decline of the West, the collapse, the Untergang of the West, of the Western civilization. In 1,000 years, since Charlemagne had kind of defected as a Frankish German to Mediterranean civilization, now mathematically Western civilization was done for, and a new primitive barbaric people would have to emerge from the ashes of World War I and take the leadership role of a new civilization. And for that matter, Spengler, despite some of his doubts, presumably greeted Adolf Hitler as a kind of embodiment of the new vital forces of Germany and a new civilization emerging in the wake of the decrepit, defunct Western civilization up until this time. So this gave added fuel when presumably a profound thinker like Spengler called for the coming of a new 1,000-year civilization that presumably would be led by the Nazi leader. We should also point out, and I neglected to mention this earlier, that we had anti-Semitic parties before World War I, not nearly as virulent as the National Socialist Party after the war, that was committed in part to fighting Jewish Bolshevism, as well as the Versailles Treaty imposed by the Western Allies, and especially by France, which in fact occupied part of Germany during the 1920s and kind of was sticking it to the Germans in this respect to make sure they paid up on their reparations due. At any rate, we had some of these earlier Christian socialist parties from before the war now became, you might see many of their anti-Semitic elements went into conservative parties during the Weimar period. And we should also point out that before the war, as well as after the war, the pan-German idea was voiced. The idea that the Germans needed to have a national home, and this was especially prevalent in Austria, Hitler's home country, as most of you know, certainly by now. So there were actually pan-German parties, especially in Austria, that appealed to Hitler in terms of we need to join the two big Germanic countries, although now after World War I, Austria was just a little runt country, but German now, rid of Hungarians and Slavs and Romanians and Italians and all of those people that shouldn't have belonged anyway, and rid of the cursed Habsburg family dynasty that allowed for this kind of mongrelization, as Hitler's term, not necessarily mine, of course, of a cosmopolitan empire. So now with a reduced Germanic Austria, it became seen as more imperative that Austria join on the part of some of these racial thinkers, but Austria was forbidden. Treaty system, not quite the Versailles Treaty, but the Austrian Treaty. The film last week said Versailles. That's good enough symbolically for us. And so the question of to what degree can we bring Austria into a larger German empire as part of this master race idea of reuniting the Germans so that they can reach their fulfillment as a unified people. This question was raised, and definitely Hitler was one to put it into implementation. Let me just read a few quotes from Mein Kampf as we're moving toward the seizure of power. Hitler is languishing in prison for threatening the state in 1923, and for him the biggest question of the time is the question of the racial preservation of the nation. This is from Mein Kampf, 1923. Peoples which renounce the preservation of their race renounce it along with the unity of their soul in all its expressions. The divided state of their nature is the natural consequence of the divided state of their blood. Blood determines nature and soul. And the change in their intellectual and creative force is only the effect of the change in their racial foundations. Any crossing of two human beings at not exactly the same level produces a medium between the level of the two parents. This means the offspring stand higher than the racially lower parent, but not as high as the higher parent. Only a born weakling can view this as a cruel view of life, but after all, he's only a weak and limited man. North America, I'm reading this because it's relevant to us in the Americas, to see how Hitler characterizes us. North America, whose population consists in by far the largest part of Germanic elements, mixed but little with the lower colored peoples, shows a different humanity and culture from Central and South America. The German inhabitant of the American continent, who has remained racially pure and unmixed, rose to be the master of the continent. He will remain the master of North America as long as he does not fall a victim to defilement of the blood. All great cultures of the past perished only because the originally creative race died out from blood poisoning. Human culture, all the results of art, science, and technology that we see before us today are almost exclusively the creative product of the Aryan. And by contrast, the Jewish people, despite all apparent intellectual qualities, is without any true culture, especially without any culture of its own. The Jew never possessed a state with a definite territorial limit, and therefore never a culture his own. He is and remains, the Jew, the typical parasites and sponger who, like a noxious bacillus, keeps spreading as soon as a favorable medium invites him. Well, I won't go on with this not very attractive prose dictated by Hitler to Rudolf Hess in the prison of Landsberg in 1923, but you get some idea of the need for the separation of the races, and especially for the Aryanism in the Aryan race to regain its purity one way or another. Now, when we've got Hitler coming to power in 1933, we have moving away from idea and speech and propaganda to actual application of the racist and biological ideas that would hopefully enhance the super race, Germans. And we've got to keep in mind, first of all, we've got a Germany that's still suffering from a lot of casualties of World War I. There are a lot of people that were disabled by the war, unable to carry their load, so to speak, that were seen as, might say, what's the word, burdens of the state, of society, one way or another. And Hitler and the Nazis were more than willing to assume that some of these burdens were not just physical, but were hereditary burdens too. And so we've got the sterilization law that was passed as early as 1933, which where for people that were regarded as having hereditary illnesses, schizophrenia, depression, whatever it might be that was seemed to be inheritable, these were placed in mental institutions, and ultimately the on your sheet of 350,000 was the number that were sterilized one way or another by the end of the 12-year Third Reich. Some of these died in the process. So this idea of even people that were Germans, were proven to be ethnic Germans through tracing their ancestry, that had bad characteristics, they had to be stopped from further defiling the master race. And a little quip in the film last week that talked about how percent-wise how many more were hereditarily ill than had been at an earlier time. So this is part of the threat that somehow the German master race was in danger, not just from outside alien elements, but from within their own gene pool stock within. So this is one element of the legislation. We've got rounding up of the homeless, of communists, and so forth as being tainted by their Marxist ideology, their class view of reality, and the establishment of the first camps, the very first of which was at Dachau, outside of Munich, the burning of ideologically harmful books, left-wing political literature, Jewish works by Jewish authors, and so forth, as certainly a visual manifestation that the Nazis meant business. And business we have in 1933 and 34, the boycotting of Jewish businesses and shops, and the subsequent Aryanization of these businesses, the takeover by the state and the finding of proper Aryan business people to run these formerly Jewish shops with no compensation, of course, to the former Jewish owners. So here we get the idea that, in fact, we saw in the film last week that the Berlin family, skiing and dancing and having a good time up until 1933, listened to Mother, and she said, let's get out of here fast. And they were among the early alarmed Jewish, good German Jews, if you will, that decided we better get out while the getting is good. And that was about, I'm not sure I put 60,000 on your sheet, but there was about that many that in the first year or two decided to heed the threats along the horizon. And this, of course, is what Hitler wanted. The more of you Jews and anybody else that leaves Germany, the better we'll all be. You won't come back or be invited back, of course, and this will allow for a pure folk community, Volksgemeinschaft, within Germany itself. Well, you have a list of a number of other decrees and actions. The Nuremberg Law we should mention because this was the law for the protection of German blood and honor. You may have discussed this already in your sections or in this class, but this was the one that forced people that had any question about their heritage to check to see if they had Jewish ancestors. And if you had papers, bureaucratic papers out there that showed that you had one Jewish grandparent, then you were considered to be Jewish. And of course, it might be contested. Well, was that Jewish grandparent really Jewish, or was he or she not? And then you check the great-grandparents and so forth. So there was a lot of shuffling of paperwork and fear of people that were unsure of their ancestry. Maybe there was certain overlooking of this or that too, but generally that was very much the exception, that one's Jewish background was overlooked, and certainly in the long run it was far less possible. No marriage or sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans. This was punishable by prison from the Nuremberg laws on up until 1939, when it was punishable by death. And of course, all that were deemed to be Jews through the Nuremberg laws and through tracing ancestry were stripped of their citizenship, and basically they were stripped of taking part in any kind of medical or judicial practice, civil servants, teaching in the universities, this kind of thing, hospital work, medicine work, was all disallowed for Jewish professionals. So we still have a fairly large number of Jews remaining in Germany at this time. The percent of Jews in Germany was, we're talking about 60 million in 1933, and generally it was never over 1%. So the rough estimate is that there were a little over 500,000 people that could be categorized as Jews as of 1933. And by the late 1930s, we've got a major rush. We've had a major rush of most of these Jewish Germans to get out of the country if they would be accepted by some other country. And if there was no acceptance, then they were doomed to having to stay in or their ship coming back. Needless to say, this was very important to the Nazis that they be eliminated from the picture one way or another, but with the German idea of we want living space for our true potential, the idea of Germany moving out into areas with far larger Jewish populations was going to cause major problems in this idea of segregation and eliminating the Jewish threat out there. Let's briefly talk about some of the efforts to educate the master race, especially those elites. We saw some of the propaganda, we saw some of the pageantry and the festivals and so forth, and getting Aryan Germans to participate and feel good about their regime, putting them back to work and so forth is great, but this didn't necessarily lend itself to thinking racially, which is what Hitler wanted more so from his German people. And so here we have ultimately, as part of this, the cultivation of an elite among the master race that would be specially educated, and elite schools that would be were established parallel with the already existing school system, where they already had heavy doses of propaganda and so forth. And so within the folk community, we've got schools that were set up especially for, you might say, an elite military caste. These were called the NAPOLAs, the National Political Educational Institutes for boys, were specially selected from ages 10 to 18, and this was a kind of mix of Prussian military spirit with National Socialist Nazi ideology. These boys were by SS officers to develop courage, dedication, and simplicity. They stressed, in a sense, preparation, gymnastic style, exercise style, technical style, the upcoming, war, the great racial war that was prepared for them by Hitler. And this meant not only exercise, but to be officers that would know how to ride horses, would be able to fly airplanes, to ride motorcycles, drive automobiles, and things like that. So transportation was important, and a mix of kind of medieval nostalgia as kind of knights of old being modernized with high technology such as it was infused in the NAPOLAs. And then we have the Adolf Hitler schools for future party members as another elite within the master race elite. These were founded in 1937, and they were specially chosen, the boys were especially chosen for presumably racial stock, healthy bodies and so forth, and with a propensity for following the party racial line, so to speak. They undertook gymnastics as well, but they were a little bit more administrative oriented. They had to study biology, racial biology of course, folklore, German customs and folk heroes. They studied foreign countries. Interesting. But you have got to know your subject people, your subhumans out there in the East. And they also studied administrative preparations and things like that for running posts in government and within the party. And then once you graduated from these schools, you could take part in the so-called order castles, Ordensburgen, which were oftentimes housed in old Germanic castles, especially in East Prussia and so forth, as a preparation for your moving into your 20s for coming war. And these boys were trained again in mountain combat, parachuting, riflery, mountain climbing, various types of sports, and biological race and ideological indoctrination. So this is some idea of what the educational training for the cream of the master race elite was all about. We should probably comment briefly as a throwback to what about the German religion, stripped of Jewish ideas and so forth. And since we're running short on time, let's just say that despite the fact that there were movements among Nazis and in the public for German Christianity, Adolf Hitler was not very interested in having any other type of competing cult in loyalty to his own. And basically Hitler felt that all organized religion was harmful to a true belief in racial destiny and so forth, and also harmful to the belief in Hitler, who had his own semi-religious cult, as you've seen in the movie and elsewhere about him. So basically Hitler put a 9 to any kind of efforts to carve out some kind of an Aryanized Christianity or otherwise. Let's see if I've got a quote. I can't find it right now. But let's briefly go on to take a look at the war. Yeah, here's the quote. Hitler says, "In the long run, National Socialism and religion will no longer be able to exist together. It'll be one or the other. And hopefully with a 1,000-year Reich, it would be National Socialism." Well, we have World War II unleashed, as we've mentioned before, and I just want to give you some of Hitler's early ideas about what, and we're talking now about the Russian front, not unleashed on France or the air war on Britain. These were sideshows in terms of the future of the master race. Here we have Hitler saying in July of 1941, as the invasion is going on, this gives you some idea of Hitler's interest in historical examples and political examples outside of Germany. He says, "Let's learn from the English, who with 250,000 men in all govern 400 million Indians. This space in Russia must always be dominated by Germans." Interesting comparison of colonial India with what the German master race would do in Russia. We'll take the southern part of the Ukraine, especially the Crimea, and make it into an exclusively German colony. There'll be no harm in pushing out the population that's there now. The German colonists will be the soldier peasant and for professional soldiers. The Reich will be put at their disposal for a completely equipped farm. The soil costs us nothing. We have only the house to build. These soldier peasants will be given arms so that at the slightest danger they can be at their posts when we summon them. That's how so much for the Ukraine. The German colonists ought to live in handsome, spacious farms. This is next month, August 41. The German services will be lodged in marvelous buildings, the governors in. Beneath the shelter of the administrative services, we shall gradually organize all that is indispensable to the maintenance of a certain standard of living. Around the city, the German city, to the depth of 30 or 40 kilometers, we shall have a belt of handsome villages connected by the best roads. What exists beyond that will be like another world, in which we mean to let the Russians live as they like. It's merely necessary that we should rule over them. What was for England in India, the territories of Russia will be for us. The Slavs are a mass of born slaves who feel the need of a master. If left to himself, the Slav would never have emerged from the narrowest of family communities. The Slav peoples are not destined to live a cleanly life, and they know it. We would be wrong to persuade them of the contrary. We must likewise prevent the Slavs from returning to Christianity. It would be a grave fault returning from underneath Stalin. It would be giving them a form of organization. We'll supply the Ukrainians with scarves, glass beads, and everything that colonial peoples like. The Germans will have to constitute amongst themselves a closed society like a fortress. The least of our stable lads must be superior to any native. For the German youth, this will be a magnificent field of experiment. Will attract to the Ukraine Danes, Dutch, Norwegians, and Swedes. So Hitler's got this grand idea of attracting Germanic peoples from all over, including America, he says here. The struggle against the hovels and the fleas and bringing newspapers to the Slavs and bringing them German teachers, none of that. We're beyond that. We're going to let them kind of grovel in their own mire. We'll treat them as redskins, he puts it. Well, enough said. I just want to mention, as the war went on, we have, as the figures now came out, we've got 24 million Soviet casualties in a European war that totaled 35 million casualties altogether. The Soviet peoples, Jewish and otherwise, constituted, about 2/3 of the total casualties, which gives you some idea of the importance that Hitler placed on the Eastern Front as a realm for the new master race out there. And it's important his prisoners of war that he captured from Russia, whether they're Slavs or Armenians or Georgians or what have you. He went, let's put it this way, the German High Command went so far as to allow these peoples to form a reserve army to be unleashed against Stalin's army. But the racist policies of the Nazis never let these people form anything really more than committees behind the lines and shoulder patches that made them uniforms. So here, you might say the master race ideology prevented the Nazis from utilizing anti-Soviet prisoners of war and the treating of the peoples of the East, so to speak, the Slavs and so forth, as subhumans when they were greeted as liberators from the Russians, from the communists and so forth, greeted the Nazi troops with bread and salt. These Slavs definitely had a change of mind, and many of them began to defect against the Nazis rather than to join up with them. So you might say that the master race idea went a long way in helping bring about defeat on the Eastern Front. To wind this up, we want to say that in Hitler's last day or so, he points out as he's there in his bunker in Berlin, the sacrifices of our soldiers and my own bond with them unto death has sown a seed that one way or another once again blossom into a glorious rebirth of the National Socialist movement, and with that the realization of a genuine racial community. This is April 29th, 1945. Hitler believes it's not over. It's going to revive sooner or later. Above all, I enjoin the leaders of the nation and those under them to uphold the racial laws to their full extent and to oppose mercilessly the universal of all the peoples. international Jewry. With Hitler's last written words, let me end this presentation. Have you got questions?
You stated that Hitler believed that National Socialism and Christianity could coexist. Do you have the page number from Mein Kampf that that was from?
I'll have to look. I'll have to look. Could Christianity and National Socialism really not exist? Actually, he said religion. From Hitler said religion and National Socialism of any kind. I really don't think that, my impression is Hitler didn't want to deal with any kind of organized religion, whatever it was, even a Germanized, Aryanized Christianity. So, not that we can't find some of his quotes from this. Basically, Hitler was the totalitarian leader that wanted not all institutions completely under his control, but institutions that would compete to degrees that they would allow him to be in complete control. And religion was one thing that the Nazis felt they couldn't, it was a hot potato they couldn't handle that well. So to kind of fragmentize it as much as possible, despite resistors. Any other quick questions, Joel?
To what extent do you think that the hierarchy, at least let's say below the level of Hitler, didn't actually believe in the genocides as sort of illustrated by the policy, fairly open policy from 1940 through 1944 of kidnapping Polish and Czech children and bringing them back and raising them as German, even when you have no idea what the so-called blood was.
Right. It would be the so-called Umvolkung, the transnationalization of those that appeared to be full-bodied Aryans one way or another. Let's put it this way, that Hitler was dyed in the wool in terms of the master race and racial purity, and were some other high-ranking Nazis, but this, as you point out, didn't mean that they all believed this. And certainly we can say that I think that the German people as a whole tended to be less racist in their thinking. They were more attracted to Hitler for reasons, for social security, security reasons, socially speaking, that they were on a roll, that life was indeed happier, as the one elderly lady said, reflecting back on those times. There was a lot going for it. It felt like there was an adventure, there was meaning, there was purpose, there was direction. And it wasn't just that, well, now's our chance to get those Jews. Not that there weren't some that felt that way, of course, but there were a lot of other reasons that Germans were attracted, and more important reasons to people than the anti-Semitism and the rabid anti-Semitism that Hitler definitely believed in to the very last, as you can see. I think our time is up, if I'm not too mistaken. Thanks. Have a good one.